far, far to the north, in the deep woods, there was a village. It had been carved out of the forest as the trees were cut, and one at a time the villagers built their houses. In the center of the village, they left an enormous spruce tree. They left it there as a reminder of where they had come from. The people in this village relied on nature for everything. They relied on the trees for their homes and for their fires. They relied on the sun to give them light, on the wind to bring them seeds, and on the rain to make the seeds grow. And because they were so remote, they relied heavily on each other. There was one house that was not in the clearing. Mother and Father North lived in a little wooden house deep in the forest. Mother and Father North were old. They had been old for a very long time. They had lived in that house for as long as anyone could remember. In fact, there was no one who could remember a time or even had heard of a time when Mother and Father North did not live there. Mother and Father North were magic. They didn't do the flashy hocus pocus, things appearing and disappearing kind of magic. They wouldn't come to your birthday party to entertain. They did quiet magic. Things like making a sick child suddenly well again, or ensuring a large harvest in a year when there was drought and it didn't seem like anything would grow. Things like that. And because Mother and Father North were never actually present when the magic occurred, no one could prove that it was theirs, but most people assumed that they were the cause. Now there was one time of year when Mother and Father North showed off their magic. On the longest, darkest night of the year, as the sun was setting over the tops of the trees, Mother North would walk from her house in the forest into the clearing, stand before the enormous spruce tree, and she would wave her arms, and a silvery light powder would land on the branches of the trees. And then Father North would wave away the clouds so that the moon would shine down and make the tree seem to sparkle and glow from within. And then they would disappear back into the forest to their little house. And the villagers would come out and they would gather around the tree and they would bring gingerbread and cider and peppermints and they would all share. And what was left was put on the ground under the tree, or even put on the branches of the tree itself for someone who might come later, or for the animals or the birds. And it seemed like the perfect way to make this long, cold, dark night not quite so dark and cold. And it seemed like things would go on this way forever, but of course that is never to be. Mother and Father North were not immortal. And one day, during the next summer, Mother North died. The villagers were deeply saddened by this, and they were concerned about how they would make it through the winter without her magic to light that dark, cold night. And so as they began to get closer to that date, they made some plans, and they baked their gingerbread, but they saved some of the flour. And on that dark, cold afternoon, just as the sun was beginning to set, they went out and they stood around the tree, and they threw handfuls of flour up at the tree. Well, most of it went back on themselves, and what little made it to the tree disappeared into the darkness of the branches. So other villagers came out with torches, and they set them in a ring around the tree, but even those couldn't light the tree the magical way Mother North had been able to. Father North was so sad, he just sat outside his house and he sighed the longest, deepest sighs that anyone had ever heard. Each time he sighed, the torches would flare up, and then they would die down again. And the smoke from the torches rose up into the clouds, making their eyes burn. And they wept big, wet tears that fell on the tree and fell on the torches, putting them out completely. So the villagers went home, not sharing the treats that they had brought. Well, the next summer, people again started looking forward to winter. They were always putting away food. They were always gathering firewood. They were making their preparations. They were worried about how they would try to create Mother North's magic that year. But something horrible happened. Late one afternoon, dark purple clouds appeared on the horizon, and the sky turned that funny greenish color, and then a bolt of lightning shot out of the sky, hit the spruce tree, and split it right in two. And both halves fell right in the middle of the village. And then the sky opened, and it poured for the whole night. The next day, the villagers came out to look to see what had happened, and it was a mess. And they knew there was no way that they would be able to recreate Mother North's magic. After a couple of days, they went out and they started to clean up. They cut the branches off of the tree, and then they used the pieces of the trunk to make boards. And they built benches that they put up in a big circle around the place where the tree had stood. And in the middle they piled all of the branches to let them dry. And as that long, dark day approached, they baked gingerbread, they pressed their cider, and they prepared to gather. They all went out and they sat on the benches around the tree. And just as the sun was going down over the tops of the forest, Father North walked out of the little house, came into the clearing, and pointed his finger at the pile of branches, and a tiny spark appeared. And then there was a little tongue of flame, and then soon the whole pile was crackling and roaring and burning with a light in which they could see each other's smiling faces. So they began to share their treats, and they noticed that Father North had disappeared. But in a few moments he was back, and now he was carrying the little wooden rocking chair that had belonged to Mother North, and he placed it in the fire. And then he backed away, and he sat with the villagers. It was a very sad and joyous celebration. It was not better than what had been before, not worse, just different, although it contained some of what had always been. Now the next summer, Father North also died. And that next year, it was his rocking chair that was added to the fire. And then every year after that, little pieces of that wooden house were brought out of the forest and placed into the flames that burned to remind the villagers of where they had come from and how heavily they relied on each other, and to remind them that sticking together through dark, cold times creates the greatest magic that there is.